Welcome to the Blacksmith Chronicles podcast, the official podcast of Ryan Johnson Ministries. This podcast was created for the purpose of equipping others for the advancement of the kingdom of God. We hope that you enjoy this episode and encourage you to subscribe to the Blacksmith Chronicles today. For more information about Ryan Johnson Ministries, please visit www.ryanjohnson.us or email us directly at info@ryanjohnson.us.
Hey guys, welcome to the Blacksmith Chronicles podcast. This week, I'm very excited, honored, and privileged to have our week's guest to be with us for a very unique but a powerful insight into areas of ministry, into life, into the world that people may or may not have the most knowledge, the most understanding with. But it's something that we must give our attention to. And I want to welcome this week's guest because if I go down this road by myself, I'm going to give you a little bit of information. He's going to give you a lot of information that you need. So I won't waste any more time. I want to go ahead and welcome this week's guest on the podcast episode, Billy Hallowell. And Billy, thank you so much for being a part of the Blacksmith Chronicles podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I want to give everybody the opportunity to get a little bit of an insight to who you are. Tell us maybe family life, home life, maybe, where you're from, what it is that you're doing. Give us that glimpse so that people right out of the gate will know who Billy is.
Sure. So I have a wife and two daughters. They are 5 and 8. They just turned 5 and 8. Their birthdays were in August, and we live just outside of New York City. So we go to a Calvary Chapel here in Westchester County. And, I've been a lifelong Christian. I have worked, which is interesting because even though I've been a lifelong Christian, my initial goal, and it's funny how God kind of takes your goals and sends you other places and says, that's not what you're going to do. I have a different goal for you, was really to work in media, which I have been able to do, but it was to cover politics. I really loved politics, but God has always brought me back toward faith. And so I was the faith editor at theblaze.com for about 5.5 years. And then I worked at FaithWire as an editor. And now, interestingly, a couple of years ago, God led me on a different path to PureFlix, which is a Christian entertainment company. And so I'm the director of communications at PureFlix, and I'm getting to kind of tell stories in a different way. And I'm there now. So that's sort of a quick 30,000 foot view. And I write books, and which is, I kind of have gone into book writing as a passion area. I pray about sort of a topic, and I kind of move into that. So it's sort of, for me, a form of ministry, of just being able to tackle something and help other people understand it. But really, I'm trying to understand it better myself as I'm going through it.
Well, I got to ask right out of the gate here, you go from the Blaze to PureFlix. I mean, they're both media heavy related, and there's some similarities, but they're not exactly the same.
No.
So what kind of challenge was that for you?
It's still challenging in good ways. And then there's the challenges of, because that passion that I have for news, right? I came to this place in 2016 when it was just so heated, and it was March of 2016 when I left the Blaze. And I knew it was going to be a rough year. I knew it was going to be hard. And I had been doing it for 5.5 years. And when I say doing it, I mean writing 6 to 10 stories a day about all different topics. And I was the faith and culture editor, but I dealt with a lot of political things too. And I was really tired. And so I prayed a lot about what I should do. And there were a couple opportunities that came up that were freelance that I had for a while. And then that brought me, by the end of the year, I was working with FaithWire. And I stayed at FaithWire for about 2 years, but FaithWire was very similar to the Blaze, right? So taking that jump over to entertainment, it was tough because I felt like, what am I doing here? And it's like, I mean, you had this for like, God, like, what is going on? I love PureFlix, don't get me wrong, great organization, but it was so different that I was like, And so I've learned a lot in the last 2.5 years since I've been at PureFlix. I've really, I've learned a lot. I think I brought different perspective there. I think they've given me different perspective. I have no idea where that goes, from here, if I'm at PureFlix for 10 years, or I don't know. But it's different, and I'm still very plugged into media in every way. I still syndicate what I write to the Blaze and other places, but it's weird not being in that news environment all day and kind of being in a much different pace of Christian entertainment, right? Very different.
Yeah. So how do you, because all intents and purposes, you're still very much of what would be described as an investigative reporter, even though you're working for PureFlix and
Yes.
you're more on, as you'd say, the entertainment side. But there's this heart for you to dive into these real stories, these real encounters, and listen. I want every listener to understand something, because even the terminology investigative reporter, that seems like everybody's that today, but very few people are actually reporting truth. They're reporting a lot of opinions and such and everything. So why is it so important for you to continue to cultivate that reportive style, that investigation, when you're going out in these things, even though you're currently in the setting that you're doing?
Yeah, it's important for me, and I try to do it as much as I can at PureFlix too, because I think, we're, as Christians, we're called to truth, right? And so I do think we're living in this era where a lot of people, even in the church, are sort of being guided by things outside of the church. It's like, well, I'm this or I'm that or I'm this politically, and there's nothing wrong with being involved in politics. But my point is, the identity should be Christian first, not whatever other thing you're a part of first. And I've been guilty of that. When I first came into media, I sort of equated everything with my faith. It's like, well, you have to be this if you're going to be a Christian. And it's like, you can go down some roads that are not always the healthiest. And so for me, it's been really about trying to get to the root of what a difficult issue is. So one of the first books, actually it was the first book that I worked on, was called Armageddon Code. And it was about the end times. And it was going to different pastors, everybody from Tim LaHaye, who was still alive at the time, down the line, and asking, what do you believe about the end times? And it was only Christians. I was looking as a Christian at what faith leaders had to say. And it was really eye-opening to present that, right, in a way that didn't tell people what to think, but that said, here are the main ideas, the main thoughts in the Christian realm. Here's what percentage of Christian leaders believe them. And you have to make a decision based on scripture, what you believe about that. And so coming to this project, Playing with Fire, dealing with, which we're going to talk about, the issue of the demonic and possession, it was the same thing. How do I take this issue, present what I know people believe about it, and investigate it and look at it, and also not mislead people. I think it's so easy, and we're well-intentioned, that we'll say something is 100% true or this particular thing happened, and we don't really know that it did. And so we have to be able to look at facts and let truth guide us. So that's really important to me, and it's something I don't plan to stop doing. No matter what I'm doing right now, my job is not a day in, day out news job. I do write some news stories here or there for PureFlix, but I'm still working on this because I believe really strongly in it.
So let's go there. Let's talk about, you've got this brand new book, Playing with Fire, and in this book you definitely dive into the demonic realm. You dive into the occult. You dive into every aspect you could possibly imagine. But why did you feel like this was something that was so important to get out there?
Yeah, I kind of huffed a little. I didn't huff. I kind of breathed heavy when you said that, because it's a tough topic, right? It's not something that I really wanted to write about, not because I'm not interested and I don't believe it, but because it's so heavy, it's so dark. And when you're going to pour yourself into months of something, you kind of look at the topic and you're like, okay, what's this going to mean for my family? And it's so easy. Like, what's this going to mean for me? And should I be afraid of this? And I think a lot of Christians, and we should talk about this because I think it's important. The church a lot of churches avoid this topic, or they don't speak about it, or they don't address it. And it's sort of there, but it's not really being talked about. And there's a real danger to that. And so I won't lie, when this opportunity came up, I sat on the opportunity for 2 months and prayed about it, because I said, is this something I want to do? I had been offered the chance to do this with a different publisher a few years ago, and I prayed about it and I didn't feel right about it and I didn't do it. And so this coming up the way it did, the circumstances of it were very strange. It kind of was just sort of dropped in my lap the second time. And after praying about it for 2 months, I knew I needed to do it. I knew it was the right thing to do. And I was really guided by the fact that I had this weird fear, which I shouldn't have had. Christians have authority over this stuff. There's no reason to be afraid. But admittedly, I was afraid to dive into it. I didn't want to do it. But then it ended up being the most peaceful, project I've ever worked on. And I know for a lot of people, And it's interesting. Some people have said, some authors have said, when they deal with this topic, they feel the most spiritually drained. They feel the most spiritually attacked. That wasn't my experience. I felt very peaceful. I felt like the pieces came together. I was able to understand all of this. See, for me, coming out of this project, I now sort of believe that the better you understand evil and what it is, the better you actually, it points you back towards Christ. You understand the need for it. You understand the impact of what's happening around us in culture, and you can sort of take that back. And I think it enriches and grows your faith to have that healthy understanding of what is actually going on.
Okay, there's two things. I want to dive into that aspect where you said a lot of churches are often maybe afraid to go down this road. Maybe they're, whether it's lack of understanding, whether it's just a spirit of fear, whatever the case is, they don't go down that journey, and that can be something that can be harmful to them. Why is that?
I have theories on this, and I think I would tell you that I had a harder time among some pastors. It was easier to get some Hollywood actors to jump in and support the book who were Christians than it was to get some pastors to really agree to even be interviewed in it. I felt like there was a little aversion to it because, well, let's start here. It's a weird topic. To the outside world, and even to some Christians, it feels very sci-fi and strange. It shouldn't, but it does, because we're in this material world and we fall guilty of this in the church all the time. Everything we believe is supernatural, right? That word we'll use, supernatural. But when you start to sit down and think about our actual existence, the fact that we're sitting here talking, that we have functioning bodies that are so complex, all of it is weird. So our existence alone is strange, right? And so I don't actually find this topic to be strange once you dive into scripture and you really look at it. But I think churches, it may be a mix of things: ignorance, not understanding the topic, not wanting to over focus on the negative. We also are living in a culture that is very much, it's sort of the selfie culture. It's all about us. We want the positive. We want to sort of have our ears tickled. We don't want to talk about evil. We don't want to get into those things. We don't want people to be afraid. And so I think it's ignorance. It's also fear of the world looking at us in a certain way, maybe. But I would argue it's probably more not knowing how to handle it, because we did a survey for Playing with Fire and the results are in the book, and it's really eye-opening. We went to about 1,200, it was a little under 1,200 church leaders. So these were pastors, these were volunteers, there were people in, running Bible studies all across church leadership. And we asked them some questions, do you believe that evil is real, that demons can, impact people's lives? 80 to 85% of them said, yes, we believe that. Absolutely. Which makes sense because it's biblical. But then when you ask people, do you believe that churches are handling this issue well? Are they talking about it enough? 78% said that some pastors and churches are not talking about this issue enough. So here the majority is saying that they believe in it, that we know this is happening. But the majority is also saying churches are not speaking about this enough. So it was really validating of the idea that a lot of people are not addressing this properly or enough. And we could talk about the impact of that. I think there's a big, major, sweeping impact of that on the church and the world, but it was pretty eye-opening.
That's interesting because you said that there were a lot of Hollywood individuals that was willing to talk or express this in ways, and a lot of leaders that weren't. And to me, that's a fascinating trend. So I wonder, is it because let's just say Hollywood across the board, Hollywood has this ability to kind of create a fantasy per se. Hollywood is known for creating, poltergeists and all these, the head spinning and the pee spitting, vomiting girl turning and all that. Do you think because Hollywood creates this environment, it's easy for them to discuss? But on the flip side of it, because Hollywood has created this personification of what it is like, the church isn't so willing to talk about it because it's things that we're not willing to engage because we really don't want to see that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, and I actually cover this a little bit in the book when I talk about The Exorcist. The movie The Exorcist in the 1970s transformed everything. I mean, that movie still scares people to this day, and it really changed the way the Ouija board is looked at. It changed the way that people interact with horror films. It also really catapulted Hollywood on this path. I mean, listen, if people think it's weird this topic, then they shouldn't go see the movies. And we know they do. The vast majority of what comes out in the horror movie genre is spiritual in some nature. And it's not representing things biblically most of the vast majority of the time. But the reality is Hollywood knows there's this innate interest in this topic because humanity since the beginning of time has been telling stories, right, of personal experiences that people have had with this. And so we're all intrigued by it. And by the way, for anybody who, is sort of wondering, what does the public think about this outside of the church? 45% of the public believe it was more than ghosts by I think about 2 percentage points. 45% of the public believe that demons exist, right? They're open to the possibility that they exist. That's pretty noteworthy in a culture that is so material that people are saying, yeah, we believe in this. We don't just want to go see a Hollywood movie about it and be freaked out. We actually believe that this exists. So I think it's really complicated. I think Hollywood has realized there's a market for it. I would also imagine if you're a Christian in Hollywood that you're pretty familiar with spiritual warfare. It's a tough thing to do, right? So I think pastors, and one thing you said really stuck out to me. I also think if we're being fair to the pastors who aren't talking about this, it's hard when Hollywood creates that image of what this is, right? To be sort of worried like, well, if I speak out about it, the world's going to think that what I'm talking about is that, and it's going to feel weird and it's going to turn people away. Because I do think there's an element of Christians, when you're going to witness to somebody, for me, I generally have found that starting with demons and the end times is not going to be the best way to always reach somebody. Not that you don't speak about it, but that it's maybe not your entry point all the time when you're kind of going in to talk to somebody who isn't a believer. And a lot of Christians do start there. And so I think that can sometimes freak people out to a degree. So I see both sides of it, but I find it troubling that so many people, I had people telling me who were Christians that I shouldn't write this book because they felt that it's giving attention to Satan, it's giving attention to evil, and that's exactly what Satan wants. And I understand that argument, although I would also argue that Satan probably wants nothing more than to fly under the radar and impact people's lives and culture without people talking about the fact that is happening. So, it's a fine line. And I think you have to go into this with the right motivation when you're doing a project like this.
Did you find yourself discovering in this journey and talking to so many different people, did you find yourself discovering that when people were ignorant, and what I mean by ignorant is the definition itself, the lack of knowledge in this subject, that they were more fearful versus those that had some knowledge? They weren't necessarily fearful, but they were just concerned because they didn't have enough knowledge.
Yeah, most of the people that I've interacted with on this, even outside of the book, even Christians, they're interested in the topic. They believe it exists, but they just don't want to dive into it because I think there's this element of fear and that feeling of if we give too much attention to it, we're going to be giving it power, which I do think if you give the wrong attention to this stuff, obviously it can give it power, but we talk about so many other things. When you look at the New Testament, it is filled with stories of demonic possession and healing. So to not talk about it, I don't know that I heard a sermon about it for a good chunk of my life. My pastor talks about it now occasionally. It shouldn't be an obsession. It shouldn't be something that we're talking about every single minute, but it's a major part of Scripture. And when you start to look at it, and I had a chance to do this for this book and really focus in on the attributes of Satan. Who is Satan? What is he doing in the world? And what are these stories of that? We don't know how people became possessed, right? The individual stories, we're never told that in Scripture. We don't know. And so that's an area, I think, of mystery for people. We do know in the Bible certain things we should avoid. So we're told those things, but that's never connected to those individual stories in the New Testament. Yet, how do we gloss over these things and not talk about them? It seems completely imprudent, especially knowing if Satan's goal is to steal and to destroy and to confuse, and you have a completely confused culture, how are we not speaking about the impact of that on not only ourselves, which I think is where the attention sometimes is, but also the culture at large?
That's an interesting response there, because it reminds me, going back to the second thing that early on you said, in this journey, you actually discovered a peace, a sustainable peace, to where you weren't in this fearful or panic mode or whatever, but How is it that you discover, what lesson in that did you discover about that piece? Because in what you just said, I think a lot of men and women of God need to understand, there's an old saying that says, know your enemy. Because if you don't know your enemy, you'll be defeated. But know your enemy. But more than you know your enemy, know who you are. And so that's one of the things. How was it that you were able to tap into something that you didn't perceive? Because you said earlier that, you was kind of concerned going in this, but then you discover this piece. What is it about that?
I think that when you look at Ephesians 6 and you go into that chapter and you start to look at taking up the shield of faith, what does that mean? What is this journey supposed to be? If we pretend that evil is not in existence, if we ignore it, if we don't talk about if everything is just about free will, and free will is important, people have the freedom to make bad decisions, even if you're influenced, right? Even if you have ideas being put in your head, if you are being, oppressed, you still have the right to make a decision and you make that choice. But when we only talk about the choice and we don't talk about any other agency that's going on, when the Bible is so clear that it is, then I think we open ourselves up to problems. So for me, as I was looking at Ephesians and I'm thinking, well, what does it mean to take up the shield of faith? Well, a lot of times I get really tired or I'm really busy and I wake up and I don't do quiet time, I don't read, and maybe a week goes by and I haven't read my Bible or I haven't prayed. Am I really taking up that shield? Am I really protecting myself? It really, for me, became more about, okay, well, how do I avoid problems in my life, right? How do I avoid making big mistakes? We're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to sin. We're sinners. But how do I avoid that? Well, you take up the shield of faith every day. That's how you do it. And it's not just this one-time thing. I said a prayer, I accepted Jesus, and now I'm a Christian and I have nothing to worry about forever. I could do whatever I want. No, it's a daily journey. It's a relationship. And so it actually brought together for me the pieces of, okay, great, John 3, being born again, accepting Christ, all of that with, okay, we look at James, right? We look at, okay, we do good works because we are Christians. We're not saved by good works. Okay, but what does it mean then to live that out? Well, having that relationship with Jesus every day. So that's a lot to say. I think it connected dots for me and then gave me a peace in knowing if I do these things, if I take up the shield of faith, and I'm not perfect, trust me, there's lots of days I still don't pick up the shield of faith the way that I should. But if I do that, well, this is all going to connect like a puzzle, and I'm going to have a healthy faith, and I'm going to be able to know when these things are happening, and not just know when they're happening to me, sense them, but also when I watch the news and I see the chaos and the looting and the killing and the craziness that's going on in this world, I know that that not all of that is coming from material things. Some of that is coming from the person or the being that wants to confuse and destroy and kill and all of that. And so, it's convoluted, but I think it connects. And for me, that gave me a peace.
With your background and your love of politics and being that investigative reporter, I'm sure you ran across some things that would easily, for a lot of even Christians, chalk up to, oh, that's just a conspiracy theory. That's just, I'm not going to buy into that demonic realm. And this is because, let's be honest, in our world today, conspiracy theories are often what is categorized in so many things. How do you help get people, especially with this book and other things that you've done, how do you get people to open up and realize that even if you think there's some kind of conspiracy attached to it, the demonic realm can also be very, very real, and we have to adhere to this? How do you try to balance that out for people?
Yeah, the one thing that was interesting in writing Playing with Fire, as I was interviewing people who deal with these issues, and I had to get in, by the way, in this book to the differences between Catholics and Protestants, and you have to address it because the Catholic Church has a very specific way of dealing with these things, and everyone else has different ways of dealing with them. And so, I had to kind of navigate that and get into that and try to understand how that works. But for me, it's all about facts, right? It's all about trying to understand what has happened. And one of the things that was consistent with everybody that I spoke with was the feeling that although this is all very real, that most of the time when people think they're dealing with a full possession or they're dealing with something very extreme, that they're actually not. That when they go in to investigate it, they find there are other explanations. Now, that doesn't mean that spiritual oppression which is different from possession, isn't happening more rampantly. In fact, it's probably happening a lot more to us, right? These ideas, these things being put into our heads. But actual possession is so rare, according to most experts. It does happen. It happens. But it's, again, when they go in to investigate, they generally find, okay, maybe that's not what you're dealing with. Maybe you're dealing with something else. But I like to look at facts, as I said. And as I started to look at some of these cases, there's one case in particular, and I'm happy to talk about it if you'd like, that really, it happened in 2011. It happened in Gary, Indiana, and it was a mother and a grandmother. So the mother, her mom, and 3 kids living in a house in Gary, Indiana. And I was working at the Blaze at the time when this story broke. And what was so unique is that, generally speaking, a possession story isn't making it into the headlines, right? It's just not something the mainstream media are going to cover. But in this case, the Indianapolis Star actually covered this story because there was a police officer who had brought the story, who had dealt with the case, had brought the story to the newspaper, and there was verifiable evidence. There were claims and there was things on the record, and there were people on the record willing to speak about it. And that's a really rare thing. And it caught my eye at the time, and we were covering it and we were looking at it and trying to understand what happened in this case. This mother said that she was experiencing possession, that her kids were experiencing it, and that they were having insane things happen throughout their rental house. And so CPS assumed, Child Services, that this was an abuse case, and the kids were actually removed from her care for a time, and the police investigated this case. Now, you had people, and I can't even believe, every time I tell this story, and I go into detail in the book about it, and I actually spoke with the priest in the book who handled it, as well as one of the sheriffs who was involved. But the CPS worker who was involved in this, she reported, and this is in government documentation, which I include in the book, that she watched one of the little boys in this house walk up a wall and basically do a somersault and land on his feet. Okay. And that this happened at a hospital, and that there were other witnesses there. And there's another witness who verifies, a nurse who verified that this apparently happened. So when you have a circumstance like that, as bizarre as it sounds, and then you have other people saying, another sheriff saying, well, I heard a voice come over the speaker in my car when I left the house telling me to get out, and you have all of these strange elements. You start to say, well, are all these people lying about this? Or did something happen that they can't explain? And so it became very clear that something happened that they cannot explain. And revisiting that story years later for this book, I didn't speak with the family. I spoke with people who were involved outside of the family. It was very, very fascinating to kind of dive into that. And so I think that's how, for me, that's how I approach things. I let people tell their story, and I let you make a determination as to whether or not you believe they're telling the truth. We have other stories in the book from other individuals who have had experiences of full possession that they believe were legitimate. And so, again, let them present it. And what's remarkable, and I would add this, is that when people are hesitant to share a story for any reason, not that people who are speaking out are lying, but when people are hesitant, it does make me pause and say, there's something there to that. Like, why don't you want to share it? It's because you are afraid, or you're feeling like people are going to think you're crazy. There's something holding you back. And I actually found that compelling with a lot of the people I spoke with.
What is the most surprising, maybe story or real life event that you heard that really made you kind of stop and go, okay, this kind of unnerves me a little bit?
I think the first one will be that Gary, Indiana case, because again, you have so many people willing to say that they saw these things. And some of the people involved in that case, one of the CPS workers, I was told, was deeply impacted by the case and left her job that year. And this is somebody who had been in that position for a long time and moved out of the state. And so, that case I found fascinating. And of course, Hollywood jumped into it. There was a guy who bought the house. I think it was Zach Bagans bought the house, and they made a documentary about it. And I didn't get into all of that. I mentioned it in the book. But it was interesting to be interviewing people and have them mention minuscule details. And maybe they weren't so minuscule, but things that happened. I didn't interview these people together, so it would be separate. And for them to bring up the same story or to say the same thing when they weren't coordinating their interviews, right? They saw things together that were compelling to them. And there were just so many things in that case. Look, anything is possible. We could find out that that family wasn't telling the truth. We could find out that everybody made it up, but I would be surprised because of the level of detail and the fact that you had, again, police officers willing to go on the record, government officials. You don't get that in most cases, right? We're having conversations about somebody saying, I had this experience, and you have to take their word for it. Here, that was different. There was another story, though, that really made me pause because it's so horrific, but it's so amazing to see this woman come out on the other side. A woman named Amy, whose story I tell in Playing with Fire. She was experiencing issues. She had never had a mental health problem in her life. Long story short, she was a nurse. She was a runner. She was athletic, never had a problem. And within an 8-month period, completely lost her mind, completely hospitalized, doctors trying to find out what had happened, what was going on. And at the climax of this story, as those 8 months were progressing, she went up to the second floor of her house, sat in the windowsill, okay, facing inside of her house. So her back is to the window, and she dropped herself out of the window. Something told her to do this. She dropped herself out of the window and is paralyzed from the waist down still. She's lucky to be alive and is now telling her story. She went through a deliverance and just has an incredibly crazy story. And the story of somebody going up to the second floor of their house, and some will say, oh, she was just mentally ill. She had a breakdown. You can read her story. You can hear what she has to say and Playing with Fire and see what you think. But to then drop yourself, not jump, drop yourself backwards out of a window and to land on a cement ground, to me, is beyond anything I could imagine ever doing, right? I mean, it's just so horrific. So there were stories like that. Again, not just the story of the shock, but of the fact that somebody could be healed from that and never have an issue again later on. That is really compelling to me.
What did you learn in this journey, how individuals can open themselves up to a demonic realm? What was it that some of the things that you typically don't think about? What did you learn?
You know, it's interesting. The Bible is so clear about not playing around with psychics and not seeing mediums and not trying to communicate with the dead, right? So it's pretty clear in Scripture, but yet you look out in culture and these things are glorified. They're joked about. You go on a vacation and there's psychics everywhere. There's palm readers. There's tarot cards. And, you know, there's the Ouija board, which a lot of people have a good time with. I think it's a fun parlor game. But what was interesting is to have interacted with a number of people, and we know there's lots of stories about this, who have used things like the Ouija board and who have had horrific things happen in their lives and in their homes as a result. Now, the vast majority of people who use a Ouija board probably never have anything happen. But there's something about this tool that people have put so much interest in actually using to try to communicate with people. And I think a lot of it's the intention. The tool itself has a whole history, which I tell in the book, that's eerie, and I think it's good to know and good to try to understand. But putting this interest in trying to say, I want to talk to the dead. I want to do something that we know we're not supposed to be doing because it's fun and it's eerie. And so that was fascinating to me. There's also the belief that repeated sin in somebody's life that's unrepentant, that could open them up to evil coming into their lives. And so there's so much to unpack there. But I think the idea of dabbling in the occult, dabbling in these tools that we're not supposed to, that is a real opening for people. Drug and substance abuse, right? There's some experts who had said that drug and substance abuse could be an opening. Not everybody believes it is, but that when you're putting yourself in these alternative realities through substances, that there are things you might see or experience, or that you could be opening a door there that would be diabolical for your life. So basically, it tends to be things we know we're not supposed to be playing around with, though. And again, I know a lot of people who say, but I use those things and I never had a problem. Well, great for you, but there's plenty of people who have used them and they've had a major problem as a result.
Yeah, everybody driving a vehicle hasn't had an accident, but a large majority that drive have accidents. I mean, that's just the reality of that. So when word gets out what you're doing, and you're compiling these stories, and we're going to get into this in just a moment. I know you're not just investigating for the sake of sharing stories, but there's a bigger picture of redemption and how God redeems individuals and so on and so forth. We're going to get to that. But my question is, what was the opposition like for you? in this, because when word really kind of gets going and you're pulling the curtain back on a lot of this stuff, especially in churches that maybe not teach this or even believe this. What was it like facing that opposition to get this book out? Now, granted, everybody's going to say, you write a book like this, you're going to encounter spiritual warfare. I get that. I know that's going to come. But I'm talking about people that just kept saying, don't do this. You shouldn't do this. And for multiple reasons. But what was that really like?
It hasn't been as intense as I thought it would be. I think there's probably some judgment of why are you doing this? And I think it's well-intentioned. It's feeling like, listen, I didn't want to write the book. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do it. So it's not like it was like I was dying to do this. I felt like I was supposed to do it. And so I did it. And I prayed throughout the whole entire thing. And for me, I think there are going to be people, a number of schools of thought. You shouldn't have done it because it's giving attention to something you don't want to give attention to. Well, clearly 78% of church leaders believe that it's not getting enough attention or being talked about. So we know that that's a problem. So I feel like that's easily dismissible, right? If you feel that this is something that shouldn't be done, well, most people, in fact, the people who have read the book, some of the reviews, people are complaining and they're giving it a negative review, not because they didn't like the way it was written or they didn't like what was in it. They felt like, oh my gosh, it was a Christian book. I didn't know it was a Christian book. I didn't want to read a Christian book on this. I wanted to go in and read. So it's like, well, what did you think? What do you think demonology is? When you talk about demons, do you think so it's interesting. A lot of the critique is in the world, people who are picking it up and they're like, oh, I didn't realize we're going to have to read about Jesus and how many people he, exorcised. And so, but I think within the church, it'll be interesting to see how people respond to it. I think there's a faction of Christians and non-Christians who think it's crazy still and who are probably, I know I have some friends, I live in New York, who are going to say, why in the world is my friend writing this book, this wacky book about this topic? And I would say, I think, again, this is an essential topic for us to be talking about. I don't care if you agree with the experts. The experts in the book have different viewpoints on how to heal somebody, on what goes into healing somebody, on all sorts of different issues. And I brought different Christian views in to give people a chance to hear them, but at least talk about it. I don't care. Fine. If you leave and you say, I don't believe this is real, I think this is wacky. Even if you're a Christian, I don't understand that perspective. It's a minority perspective in the church, I think, but that's your right. But at least talk about it, entertain it, understand what is going on, because how can you have a proper understanding of Scripture if you're ignoring a massive part of, 1/3 of the healings that happened were basically exorcisms with Jesus, right? So anyway, I think it's an important topic for us to all be talking about.
It reminds me when I was very young in the Lord, I definitely did not believe in anything demonic. I have in my mind, it's all the Hollywood version. It's a bunch of hoopla. But I always said, you can deny the demonic all you want until you see a woman crawl around on the floor like a snake and talk in a voice deeper than J.D. Sumner. Which for my 40 and under crowd, J.D. Sumner was a famous bass singer back in the day. So when a woman who looks like olive oil slithers around on the floor like a snake, talks in a voice deeper than J.D. Sumner, and pushes away grown men that are about 6'5", 325 pounds, you have my attention.
Right. Right.
That's the point where I went, okay, maybe there's something to this at this point. But here's what I love about the way you keep saying this over and over, how you collected all this stuff. And this is where I really get the investigative reporter out, and I hear it so much in what you're saying, because you're saying, I'm collecting all this information, and I'm giving you all these resources, but I'm also giving you how other leaders in the body of Christ say that they handle it, they deal with it. And you're allowing that reader to go, okay, I'm going to learn this. I'm going to dive into this. You're not point blank saying this is the only way to deal with this stuff, because there's different levels of understanding a demonic realm. There's different levels of, where people are at in their revelation. So why was it simply just because you're just an investigative reporter, or did you really feel like it was so important to put that book in that manner for people to be able to depend more on what God is showing them in how to handle these things versus an author just pointing the way in a book?
What you just said is absolutely the case. When I wrote the end times book, Armageddon Code, it was the same thing. My training, the one thing that God has given me, the one skill that He's given me is to interview people and pull information out and try to put information together. That's what I love to do. And I think for me, I know I was reading one of the reviews, and I try not to read reviews too much, but they're helpful. They help you say, how can I do better next time, or what? There was somebody who was not a Christian, and they were saying, I read the book, and it almost could drive some people crazy how many facts and figures and details there are, but it almost is refreshing because you don't get that a lot. We can buy a million books on the end times and a bunch of books on spiritual warfare, but I feel like it's generally, and there's nothing wrong with this, if people want to do this, telling people what to think about it from an individual perspective. Whereas I want to tell people, yes, this exists. This is real. We know this, but let's actually look at all the different elements. I mean, there's a major debate, for instance, over what are demons? Are they fallen angels? Are they Nephilim? Are they, there's even 1% of the people in our survey, which I thought was interesting, felt that demons were the deceased loved ones, or deceased people that had become demons. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. 1%. Wow, if church leaders believe that. But really having these discussions, okay, well, why do some people believe that they're not fallen angels? Why do they believe this Nephilim theory? What is that theory? And trying to help people navigate those difficult pieces of the discussion, not to lead them down a path they shouldn't go, but to really help us all understand, what is this debate? What is an exorcism? What is a deliverance? Why do Catholics have a very specific way of doing it? Why does that differ for others, right? Because again, we don't hear these things in most books because we dive in and we read it and we get that one perspective without understanding the full picture of it. And interestingly, even the Catholic Church, they invited, for the first time in 2019, they invited non-Catholics into their exorcism training. And I thought that was really interesting that they were like, oh, maybe we need to have a conversation with people who are doing this differently to understand what they're seeing. And now there's lots of theological debate to be had about, Catholicism versus Protestantism and all of that. But I went into it to help people understand, okay, this is what's actually happening. There's a meeting every year in May at the Vatican with exorcists, right? And so now we have people who aren't Catholic attending that. And I interviewed one of those people in the book as well.
For a lot of people, when they read the book, they're going to come at the end and they're going to say, okay, I didn't know this about me. And I get some kind of revelation about me. What was it that you got about yourself when this journey comes to, and you release this to the publishers, even after the final editing, and that you sat back and went, wow, I didn't even realize this about me. I didn't, maybe your own thought, your own struggle. What was it that you got that really impacted you?
I think minimizing the reality of these things, knowing in my head that they exist, but not always thinking about it in my heart, to the point of being able to say, how is that TV show impacting me? Or not to an obsessive level, not to there's a demon behind every doorway, because that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that, it's so easy to go through life and do whatever we want to do within the confines of Christianity, but to kind of watch whatever we want or not feel convicted about things. And I think going back to Ephesians 6, going back to, okay, I need to make sure, and I knew that I needed to before, but that I am doing what I need to do every day to protect myself and my family. And I think praying for my kids in a different way too, of praying for their protection in a different way, not just their success in life and that they'll love Jesus, of course, but that they'll also not just love Jesus, but they'll take up that shield every day. They'll do what Ephesians calls us to do. And so it just kind of led me into a space of thinking differently, really, about everything. And we think we can solve the world, right? Like we think politics is going to solve it all, that if we elect this person, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to elect a specific person or believing it's the right thing to do, but that's not our end all and our be all, that there is an influence that is happening. Again, there's this battle between good and evil. And I think I was much more likely to believe that in my mind than I was to sort of live that out in my practice. And I think writing the book really changed that for me. I'm looking at these issues a lot differently. And I'm not skeptical of people's stories. I want to verify that I'm dealing with somebody who's telling me that what they experienced, they truly believe it was that. And so I'm trying to be, I think I become more open to that and understanding that within the confines of making sure I have the facts to back that up.
So if you had something to say right now, and you could say to men and women of God, just whether or not it's a warning, whether or not it's just advice, encouragement, whatever, when it comes to the demonic realm, what is that one thing that you would like to say to them?
You know, I think what I would say is, if you are living your life, whether you're going to a church that addresses this or not, it really comes down to whether you are addressing this or not. Because if we're pretending this doesn't exist, if we're walking around living our faith out and doing the right thing, even right, and reading our Bibles every day, but we're not acknowledging that this is a real thing in existence, then I'm not sure we can properly understand what's happening in our own lives and our friends and families' lives and in the world around us, right? That, to me, this gravity of, and I've actually, you had asked the question before this, of what would I say, right? Or I'm sorry, of what I've learned about myself, rather.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that when I look at the events and the chaos around me, that I first want to say, we need to change this policy, or we need to move this over here, we need to do this. You need to get people saved. Like, if you're not, like, this changes the way we think about everything, because we could talk about systems all day long. And yes, there are things in systems that can and should be changed. But at the end of the day, what really changes a system are the people that make that system up. And, we need to be changed from a heart level. And if we're not considering the existence of these things in a proper way, I'm not really sure we understand just how much need people have to change individually and then collectively.
You said something there, just, man, so good when you said, even if your church is not recognizing it, you need to recognize it. And I want the listeners, those who are listening and watching, really to pick up on that, because you may be in a church right now that is not necessarily adhering to this, but it should not stop you as a son or daughter of God to be able to recognize, hey, this could be some things that I'm opening up for my family, or my teenagers are opening up to themselves, or whatever the case may be. Because there are things that we can open ourselves up to. And I get it. Everybody's not got a Ouija board. But one of the things that is so popular in a lot of people's lives is horoscopes. And that seems so trivial to a lot of people, but it is potentially a gateway to a lot of other things. And granted, I'm sure, Billy, you'd even say, certain movies and genres and stuff that can, I'm never shocked when I meet some of the most demonically oppressed people. I'm never shocked when I found out that their favorite genre of movies is horror. It's not a shocking thing, because it goes hand in hand. So I sincerely appreciate your willingness to write this book. I want everybody to know that, there is a redemptive quality to the book. It's just not, hey, this is the enemy, this is what he does, and we're glorifying the enemy. Yeah. There is that redemptive. So I'm going to ask you in that, why is it so important to know the redemptive side of this?
I think it's absolutely essential to understand it, because there are so many people who are suffering and they're dealing with oppression. I think that's the most common thing. They're feeling oppression. Christians can be victim to oppression, to being oppressed, by the demonic. And when you look at these stories of people who have gone through these unimaginable things, what was it that brought them out of it? It was Jesus, right? It's this idea. I think we have to understand, if we're afraid of this, we're not realizing the power of Christ. If we're afraid of this topic, we're not realizing that with Christ, we have power over it, right? And so when you look at stories like Amy, I told the story of her dropping out of the window. Well, okay, that's the part that might get the most attention, but the part that I think is the most phenomenal is that she was healed. A woman heard about her story, went to the hospital as she was recovering, and did a deliverance on her. And she was healed and has never had this issue again. And what is Amy doing now? She's telling her story. She's trying to inspire other people who are also facing, maybe not as pronounced as what she was facing, but they're facing oppression. And so we have to realize that there's healing, and there's healing for all sorts of things that we're dealing with, right? I mean, not everybody, 99% of people are probably never going to be possessed, have a full possession, but that doesn't mean you're not going to deal with the spiritual realm. And so I think when we look at our lives, when we look at the lives of others around us, you never want to be in a position where you're treating something improperly. If it's a mental illness, you don't want to only be treating it with spiritual. If it's a spiritual illness, you don't only want to be treating it with medical means, right? Because it's not really treating it. It's putting a Band-Aid on the problem. And so I think we have to be aware. And sometimes it's more than one thing. Sometimes we're dealing with a cross section, right? And so the redemptive piece is so important. And even the movie The Exorcist, the real life story that supposedly is based on that movie. Okay, it's about a little boy. He was apparently healed and went on to live a normal life and have children. And interestingly, his identity has never been revealed, which I find fascinating. And I talk about that in the book. And he never wanted his story out there. But I do think there's something powerful in hearing these stories because it gives hope to those who really don't have it.
That's what it's about right there. It's such a powerful statement. So how can people learn more about you? Where can they find you at?
You can go over to billyhallowell.com and also playingwithfirebook.com. Those are two websites you can go to. And I'd also encourage people head over to insider.pureflix.com. There's daily writings, Bible verse lists. We're talking about taking up that shield, right? Every day. We've got a lot of resources there that are free daily for people to read and check out.
Awesome. And I would encourage everybody, order your copy. I mean, also for those that order stuff, it's on Amazon. Is it available
Yes.
through that?
Yep.
Amazon and stuff. But if you can, order it through Billy's website and such. But I know how people are. Some people just like that little click and once.
It's so easy.
It is. I mean, it's true.
It's too easy.
I've done the very same thing on Amazon just because of the simplicity of it. So I guess the greatest question on is, where's Jimmy Hoffa buried? No, I'm just joking. You touch in the demonic realm, you probably find out life's most hidden secrets, right? I mean,
Oh yeah, I mean, I think we underestimate it. We don't really think. And when these serial killers are on TV or then you think about it, you're like, okay, there's this level of evil there. But I think we need to realize it extends far beyond that.
Yeah, it really is. And again, even if you don't know, you're not very familiar about this in your walk with Christ, it's something that you should not fear. It's something that you shouldn't be consumed with, and that's all you think about at the same time. There is a healthy biblical balance to this. You should never lose your redemptive side to this, but we can't be blind in the reality that there is a demonic realm and a force that is very active. And that's active politically, that's active in Hollywood, that's active in different realms of media and so on and so forth. So I do think it's very beneficial for us to be wise. Scripture says we're to be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. And this is one of those areas that we have to adhere to. And I sincerely appreciate your willingness to put this out there for many other people, the work that you did for The Blaze, and now you're doing with PureFlix. I can't wait to see the version of The Exorcist on PureFlix. That'll be No,
I actually would love somebody in the Christian world to tackle this in the right way. We haven't seen that yet. There actually hasn't been a Christian film that I know of off the top of my head that has really tackled this in a compelling way.
Yeah, I don't know one either. And it would have to be very, very good because I'm guilty right here. I'll admit my guilt right here. I struggle with a lot of Christian movies because of the acting and the storylines and such. So it would be very, very profound if it was done really, really, really well. So that would be awesome to see. That's for sure.
It would be. It's a good idea.
Do you have any? There you go. Write the script. So, do you have any final thoughts? Anything you'd like to share with those that are listening?
Yeah, I would just encourage people to pause. Life is busy. Stop. Think about where things are in your life, and if there's not peace, why isn't there peace, and how can you get it? I know so many people are looking for peace desperately, and it's so hard. I've been there before too, where you just can't. You're so overwhelmed by your circumstances. There's thoughts in your head that are just negative. And I think we've got to stop, reassess, and think about Ephesians 6. Read Ephesians 6. Just start there and really think, am I doing what I need to do every day to make sure that I'm protected? Because I think that will change everything, because most of us will realize that we're not.
That's so good. So good. Again, thank you so much. and tell your family and stuff. Appreciate you taking time out to be a part of the podcast today. For those that are listening, we want to remind you that we hope and pray that this podcast has encouraged you, it has equipped you, and it has challenged you. Until the next episode, guys, know that you're loved and you have a purpose and a great assignment for the enlargement of the kingdom. And we bless you in the name of Jesus.
Thank you for listening to the Blacksmith Chronicles podcast. It is our prayer that this episode challenged you, encouraged you, and equipped you for the advancement of the kingdom of God. For more episodes or ways that you can partner with Ryan Johnson Ministries, please go to www.ryanjohnson.us or email us directly at info@ryanjohnson.us. Please join us again soon for another episode of the Blacksmith Chronicles.